Welcome to Mission Undercover. Today's guest is the most exciting one yet. Joining me today is Christopher Angle, author, philosopher, and host of the Philosophical Angle podcast. We are going to discuss philosophy, issues of inequality and wealth in society, economic growth and productivity, the AI revolution, and how we can respond to the pressing challenges that our societies face today. Could you start by telling me more about your podcast and about you and your values? What topics do you explore, and what, in your view, is the most important issue and challenge that societies face today?
Okay, my particular talent is to be able to define concepts that occur that have a philosophical background to them. So I've written books on things like ethics and aesthetics and the nature of truth and uh, and and politics and economics. And so I'm able to define these concepts and put them in some cases into mathematical formulas. So the most recent one is probably relevant to and probably the most interesting for today's audience because the title of it is The Nature of the Political Left and Right. And with today's political environment, it's unknown to a lot of people why there is such a divide and what to do about it and how does it occur. And so it's an interesting subject, especially in today's environment. And to give you an example of that, people wonder why there is such a divide. And so we look uh, uh, to what I call there are 7 principles in politics that dictate how politics has evolved and how it operates. And there's one set of dictums for the left and one set of principles for the right. And as you can imagine, they're the opposite. So just to start off, people are wondering why the media is so vehemently opposed to President Trump. And we haven't seen such media vehemence since, I would say, since Ronald Reagan. And why it has happened is that there is the third principle of our 7 is that that the left will look at another person and think that he is not so good, that his nature is bad. And this has religious as well as philosophical confirmation. I know in the Bible it says that all fall short of the glory of God. So there's an understanding that yes, a man is deprived, man is wicked, man is not so good, and the left in their hearts feel that outside of themselves, like others in other political parties or others with other beliefs and understandings, and that they're not so good. But yet the right looks at the same person and might say, well, although he's bad and he falls short of the glory of God, but there is some good about him, and let's try and discover that. Once we discover that goodness, in political terms, we'll come together and negotiate a settlement that will extract that goodness, and we'll be able to move forward. And so compromises are made politically, but at the same time, the left doesn't like giving it up because you're bad. And so they hate giving up very much in concessions and working together. And that's why governments of the world tend to move left little by little. And then suddenly somebody comes in who becomes politically powerful and drags that left-leaning tendencies back suddenly, and they go berserk. The reaction is tremendous because it's happening one way, it goes slowly, but then in the other way it goes back quickly, and they hate it. And the last time we saw that was with Ronald Reagan. He started to drag that back all at one time, and the press went berserk at that time. So these 7 principles has some bearing on being able to explain what's happening in today's and probably the first thing we need to be able to understand is when considering politics is where the political party came from in the first place. Why is there a political party? Why are there divides? Well, it all starts when, anthropologically speaking, when there weren't so many people spread around the globe, in fact, very little, and when there were all coming out of Africa, and we lived in tribes. And when we lived in tribes, everybody knew everybody else, as the anthropologist and zoologist Desmond Morris pointed out. And when everybody knows everybody else, everybody's pretty equal, and everybody gets along. And so what happens, though, is that when you're in a tribal situation or in any group, and not only for humans, but for other mammals that travel in packs and groups, we can notice as the first, I'm going to call him the first anthropologist in history, St. Augustine knows that one person will tend to dominate. One male will rise and dominate. And in the early tribal situations, that happened. One is a little bit stronger. One man's a little bit stronger, maybe a little bit more intelligent, maybe a little more influential in some ways. And he rises and becomes the leader of the group. And so all groups tend to have a leader, and not only for men, but for animals also. And once he gets a group, then once he becomes head of a group, then he naturally, because of the first principle of life and economics, that all life does that which is good for it. And so just like the deer or the reindeer are fighting it out to who gets the female herd, a man in a tribal situation who rises to the top, he'll want a little more for himself than for the rest of the group. And for the rest of that group, he extracts a little bit of goodness for himself as being the leader and naturally wanting more for himself, which is observant of the first principle of life and the first principle of economics in general. So he rises to the top, and then that causes the first political party. He now represents the haves, and the rest of the tribe represents the have-nots. And so history evolves, more people come into the world, and more people travel throughout the world and settle throughout the world up into Europe and into Asia. And as the groups expand and become more prolific and get and grow, and what happens is that not everybody knows everybody else in society. And thus you have the first time you get man's inhumanity to man, because not everybody is known throughout all of the tribe. It becomes a society where king arises, and thus you get a clear distinction between the have-not of societies and the haves of societies. And throughout history, that's the way it's always been: haves and have-nots. And the kings and queens, and they need help in performing their edicts into society. And what happens is that they hire an aristocracy. They hire their knights. They hire their enforcers. They hire their armies, they hire their sheriffs, they hire everybody that can help them, and they are part of the aristocracy, and these are part of the haves. They look down upon the have-nots. So now that we've discussed the first three dictums of political society, we now have to discuss the fourth. So all society throughout the last 2, 3, 4,000 years are ruled by the haves over the have-nots, because they're become the kings. And they start all the wars, and because once they get everything from their own societies, they want more, so they invade their neighbor, and that causes war. And so, because the neighbor doesn't like it, and so they've got thousands of wars for a couple thousand years. And then suddenly, throughout history, every once in a while, what happens is that the have-nots rise up. They get so downtrodden that they rise up and they revolt. And that's called a revolution. So there are two types of war: regular war, and then the wars initiated by the have-nots, and that is called a revolution. And so we've had some great revolutions, and the most significant ones were 1688, the English, when the English created their Bill of Rights, not as strong as the Americans, but gave some rights to the people away from the king. And then the American Revolution happened, and then the French Revolution happened. And the most remarkable thing that occurred when these two revolutions came about is the advent of democracy. And so suddenly, kings could no longer dictate their own particular priorities. And suddenly, they had to convince the have-nots to vote for them. And so now we're going to get some big divides in the political system, because the haves have to convert from dictatorial, totalitarian, to working with the have-nots, working with the other side. And so as time goes on, you get a bigger divide. So then after the French Revolution, the aristocracies kind of hanging out in Europe and going, because some of them have not yet converted over to democracy, they're hanging around in the 80s going, well, we don't want that to happen to us. We don't want that French Revolution coming over and everybody chopping our heads off. So here's what we're going to make it. We're going to make a deal with the have-nots. We're going to say, we, the aristocracy, are going to always supply for you, the have-nots, we're going to always supply a base living so that you'll have enough for food and you'll have shelter, and we'll take care of you. We won't be as cruel as we were in the past. And that little theory was called noblesse oblige in history, and it came about in the 1820s. And then that idea gained some strength, and in 1848, famous book, the Communist Manifesto, was written. And the second, and about the same time, the second French Revolution. And so what happened is that then you had socialism got a real firm grip on society and started to expand. And the idea that the poor shall be helped by the government expanded. So that is principle number 4, noblesse oblige, the obligation that the have shall help with the have-nots. That idea expanded and is still around today. As you can see in government programs throughout the world, try to help the poor, as per the uh, that dictum. But then uh, you get dictum number 5, um, which is that famous Lord Acton statement that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When you have a totalitarian, when you have a king, and throughout the history of kings, and now within the history of totalitarians, in any place where you have total authority, and I don't know if you've ever read Solzhenitsyn's First Circle and his depiction of Stalin. It's remarkable, and it gives insight into about what I'm about to say. So anytime you get a totalitarian, a king, queen, president totalitarian, like in North Korea or whatever, they believe, because power corrupts, they believe that their priorities are the only priorities that matter in the world, and especially for their society. And the reason for that they believe that, is that once you become all powerful within your society, and your mind becomes corrupted, it becomes corrupted because you realize you don't have to cooperate. And if you don't have to cooperate, then only your priorities matter. And thus you got certain beliefs by the kings and all totalitarians that they were God's representative on earth. That was called the divine right of kings. So as they believe that they don't have to cooperate with others, then they don't have any ethics, which leads us into the next principle. Because ethics is the appropriate dispensation of respect. And respect is the anthropological mechanism by which we are able to cooperate with each other. And we cooperate with each other in order to produce goods and services. And we produce goods and services in order to bring us up away from misery and bring us into life which has goodness. And so that's the principle of ethics, is to be able to allow us to produce more goods and services through respect of the other human being. And what happens to the totalitarian leader is that he knows that he doesn't have to cooperate anymore. He can just order people to produce goods and services. And when he doesn't have to cooperate anymore, he has no respect for those who work for him. And when he has no respect, he has no ethics. And so when you have no ethics, all that is left in his heart is that the end justifies the means. And if you take a look at all the kings and queens throughout history, if you take a look at all of the totalitarian leaders, present and past, you see that they could kill, or they could dispose of, half their population. 50 million. Mao, 50 million. Stalin, probably 50 million. Pol Pot, 50% of his, in Cambodia, 50% of his population. They could dispose of them, and they go home at night and they sleep well, because they believe that they are God's gift to the world. Their mind has been corrupted because they don't have any ethics, because they don't have any respect, because only their priorities dictate how the world should operate. So they have no ethics, and so they sleep very well. And so the nature of the totalitarian beast is for total control of society.
You've raised some really interesting points about how societies evolved throughout history and how they go from a form of primitive communism and collectivization through to individualism and maybe even totalitarianism. But I've got a few follow up questions from what you said, and it was interesting how you mentioned that politics has become quite rigid and ideological. Why do you think that is? Why do you think leaders can't transcend political boundaries to do what is actually best for the country?
Well, they all believe in their priorities. We need to define at this point we should define freedom. So freedom is the creation of a priority in your mind and then the effectuation of the priority into society. And so when you're freely can create your priorities and freely employ them as you will individually, you have success in society. And when you freely create your priorities and you effectuate them into society, and it's the only ones that are effectuated, then you have total control and you have a huge dichotomy of the have and have nots. But as society moves, because of the revolutions and because of democracy, as societies move toward away from total control, you get more knowledge into societies because priorities are a type of knowledge. And as freedom comes into societies, those are the ones that become more prosperous. And as they become more prosperous, they also become more peaceful. So as that dichotomy between freedom and control happens and uh, uh, throughout the world, the wider that divide is, the more conflict. The closer that divide becomes, the more peace you have. So I hope that answered your question.
So, why do you think we haven't had revolutions for such a long time? We have such steep social stability despite similar conditions and similar levels of social unrest to the eras of the French Revolution and previous revolutions in history. Why do you think social stability has been so firmly maintained?
Social stability has been firmly maintained because freedom, since the revolutions, the American and French revolutions, because more freedom has come into societies, have come into the world. And as that freedom pours into the world, you get more respect of the individual and you get peace because freedom equals peace. The more you have freedom in society, the more you're going to have overall freedom and peace between nations. It was that old, remember that, and they do so because when you have freedom, you also have free market enterprise and free market enterprise and free trading. And I'm reminded of that old adage by, I think it was Foucault, that said, if goods don't travel across boundaries, armies will. And so as the flow of commerce throughout the world has increased, so has the stability of the world increased.
That vision and idea that you're presenting of totalitarian oppression lives within the memories of so many people due to the legacy of the Cold War and because of dystopian literature like 1984 by George Orwell. So, do you think that part of the solution is decentralization and direct democracy, giving a say directly to communities and involving them more in the decision making process to actually calibrate politics towards the priorities of the people? How do you think we can achieve that?
Well, as direct democracy, there's a problem with direct democracy is that it's inefficient. It's difficult for everybody to be directly involved with politics and yet hold a full-time job. So, in order to be allow efficiency in the with the political arena and the free market enterprise and your job to create goods and services for your own health, for your own family, for your own well-being, you have to be kind of efficient. So direct democracy be good, but it's just so inefficient because it would take our time away from making a living for ourselves. So we hire professional politicians, and then with professional politicians we have to have an agreement, and the agreement is called, like in the United States, it's called the Constitution. Um, and then you have, in addition to the Constitution, and this is kind of the genius of the founding fathers of the United States, they did something that allowed the United States to become the most successful, economically speaking, the most successful country in the world. And as such, people from all over the world, they want to come here. And they do that because those founding fathers attached to the Constitution 10 amendments. And those 10 amendments guarantee freedom for the individual, and they guarantee that the individual is not going to have the government knocking on his door going, we're taking all your assets. And not only that, we're going to use your house. So that's prevented in the United States. So everybody wants to come here. And the reason why is they know that if they are successful, The government's not going to come along and take it away. Uh, and so that's why the United States is the most successful. And also the problem of because they have a constitution, and so they don't need direct democracy. They got the professional politicians in between, governed by the Constitution and by the Bill of Rights. And so, as for a reasonable methodology by which to govern society and which to allow society to prosper, I think our system is the best because of the 10 amendments.
I think a lot of what you said links to the idea of the social contract, an implicit agreement that allows people's decisions to be taken on their behalf by others who are more powerful than them. But I also want to focus more on what you said about divides within society. These divides are natural and they're necessary. But don't you think that society's incentives and opportunities should be equal for everyone? And that true freedom is actually access to resources and access to opportunity. So don't you think that everyone should have an equal opportunity to access these resources, to access
They do.
improvements in their lives, meritocracy, if you will?
They do. All are equal in front of the law. All are equal here.
That's not necessarily true. There is an issue of institutional racism and institutional barriers to access. There's also issues that the tax system inherently favors existing wealth. It taxes assets far less than it taxes income. Do you think that's a fair system?
Well, I'm not quite sure. You mean you're talking about, well, the tax system is, when you say, well, first of all, when you say fair, we need to define that. What is fair? And fair means that both sides to a contract are adherent to the contract. And so that there's an agreement or a contract in place and so when you're fair, both sides have a ability to fulfill the agreement. And so the United States, if one person's very rich, he did it from working hard. And because of the 10 Amendments, his ability to work hard is the same as everybody else in societies. But I think what you're referring to is that when after one person fulfills his needs and becomes prosperous, why doesn't the other person have prosperity? But he does because of the first dictum of society that all life does that which is good for it. And so when somebody becomes rich, what happens is that he wants more for himself. And so if he let's say it's a primitive society, and so he gets rich and the wife says, I don't want to go down to the well every day and get water. So he says, okay, I'll hire somebody to do that. And so a job is created. And so the next door neighbor who had nothing all of a sudden has a job to go get water for the rich man. Yes, some people create wealth and then become prosperous, but they also with them give that prosperity a chance for other people to create prosperity for themselves because of fairness. They will construct contracts for other people to work for them, and then they become prosperous. And as society advances, there's something we probably should talk about here, is that as society advances and prosperity advances, it does so by 4 or 5 ingredients, and those are risk and opportunity. And that's the flip side of the same coin. The more you have risk, the less you have opportunity. The more you have opportunity, the less you have risk. So risk, time, effort, information, knowledge, complex, and if it's a product, you got to add in material. So as societies become more advanced, and they become advanced by taking one of those 4 ingredients of a transaction, of an economic transaction, they take one of those 4 ingredients and they add in more, like they'll work harder. So the effort goes up. They'll spend more time, so they become prosperous through spending more time. But the real reason for advanced societies is that knowledge. They create knowledge, and knowledge is the form that being able to create efficiencies in the workplace, inefficiencies in being able to produce more with less. And so as knowledge is created, societal economic progress is made through efficiencies created by knowledge and allows people to become prosperous. And so the way, if neighbor A goes out there and one of those 4 or 5 ingredients increases his lifestyle, his neighbor can do the same thing by increasing his knowledge. And so knowledge is one of the very basic ways that society can prosper and grow. So to answer your question, yes, some people prosper more than others, because of those four or five ingredients. But the other ones can get also because their opportunity is equal. They have access to all four of those. If they have access to all four of those, four or five of those ingredients, they too, especially the knowledge part, if they too go out of school and get more knowledge for their lives, and they too can prosper almost anywhere
I
here in
think
the
what you're
United
saying
States.
isn't really correct because the access to opportunity isn't actually equal because people who are from a poorer background can't access education as easily. Look at how expensive university is. Look at how the people who have inherited wealth and people who are born into wealth can just make an advantage in society by buying their way through society, by getting private schooling, by improving their position through their existing position, not through any form of merit, but through inherited wealth. And often that inherited wealth is a product of ill gotten gains and immoral gains. So that wealth is not inherently justified.
Well, you've mixed a couple of different problems there,
I'm not
but
saying that merit isn't real, but our societies aren't inherently meritocratic. Merit is the exception, not the rule.
so as I mentioned, with the ingredients of any transaction, the first ingredient was risk and opportunity. And so you are by risk, and that's the nature of the world. Some people are born with better opportunities, and some people are born with less opportunities. And that's due to risk because we're not all in the same place at the same time under the same circumstances. So the purpose of society is to give as much opportunity to those who don't have as much when they start. So that's not to say that those who have already got prosperity, that's not to say that they're wrong. They were right to make themselves a better life. And those who don't have a better life, they need to be afforded the opportunity through their effort, their time, their knowledge. And as long as that's afforded, their life will get better. And that's all we can ask of the world because the world is filled with risk and not everybody is born in the same place at the same time.
The point is that poorer people are not as insured against risk as richer people are. And also, people who are already rich are insured from losing their wealth because of the way the system operates. The people who are already in wealth are maintaining their wealth because of the perverse incentives of society that are keeping them within their position whilst locking other people out of ascending to their position. So, do you think that it's necessary to recalibrate society to favor everyone equally, to have equal access to opportunity? Because opportunity is not equally accessed right now, even though it should be, because that is how meritocracy should work. That is how ethical and moral capitalism should work. But that's not the way our system is operating. And that is a reality that's continually denied by the people who are in power because it serves their interests.
Well, it depends on what country you're talking about. It depends on where you, what locale we're talking about. It depends, like, for example, if an individual is in the United States, oh yes, he's afforded any opportunity to go to school, learn, and do well if he wants. But that's not true of other places because there's no other country outside the United States that has the Ten Amendments that guarantees opportunity for everybody. That if you work hard or if you try more, if you create more knowledge for yourself, that you'll be able to prosper. It depends on your area, your place, and what documents and what mechanisms are in place to protect the poor. And so the poor were never protected until the revolutions. And then the revolutions came about and said, "Hey, we're the downtrodden. We're here too, and we're going to cut your head off because you have not behaved well with us." And I think that's the argument you're presenting, that the downtrodden, the have-nots, still have their problem of being have-nots. But society over the last 200 years since the American and French revolutions have done much better in places that allow the have-nots their rights to formulate agreements and contracts and go out and cooperate with others to do better. And as long as you have that protection, as afforded by the Ten Amendments, as long as you have that protection, then your risk goes down and your opportunities increase because the government, because the haves, because this agreement in between the have and the have-nots is now relevant to all, have and the have-nots. And as long as you have that opportunity, then the have-nots will eventually all do well. As you can see in the United States, we have very little poverty here. And so if that document, if that agreement were to be placed throughout the world, you'd see tremendous wealth created throughout the world.
I agree that the strength of institution really is necessary to maintain people and to support them in society. But in this sense, the Constitution is a paper tiger because the government of America and the government of other Western nations are so beholden to corporate interests. And because of the pernicious influence of lobbying, they're constantly catering to the interests of the wealthy. So the interests of the working poor are continually neglected. And the Constitution doesn't really seem to be protecting the people of America from the encroachment of the expanding American authoritarianism under the Trump regime. And what you said earlier about the media opposing Trump, the media has been completely acquiescent to Trump. The media has not opposed Trump enough, considering the fascistic nature of his policies.
Well, okay, so we're expanding our conversation from the nature of wealth to current political events. They're so far different that I hesitate to jump in and debate that point about whether Trump is a fascist or not. First, we'd have to define fascism, and then we have to see if what his actions are commensurate with fascism. And so I'll define fascism. Fascism is the ownership of the means of production to be able to receive the profits of the means of production in a society. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
No, I would say that's communism. Fascism is a form of all encompassing state control.
What's the difference? You said all encompassing state control. That is just what I said, that fascism is the ownership of the means to production, which is equal to all the companies.
Well, do you dispute that the Nazis were fascist? Do you agree that the Nazis were fascist?
Yes, because they
The
got
Nazis did not
control,
control the means of production. There was immense and vast private industry during the era of the Nazis.
but those companies were influenced. They didn't own, the Nazis didn't own technically the companies. They were socialists, but they influenced the production of the companies.
I would
And
dispute
then,
that they were socialists. They were socialists only in name. It was a veil to mask their true intentions because their name might have been National Socialists, but they didn't actually embody any of the characteristics of socialism. They didn't embody the ideal of what Marx described as class struggle and the protection of the working poor. I don't necessarily agree with socialism, but come on, you're calling the Nazis socialists.
well, they were socialists in the sense that they controlled the output of the means to production. So they would tell the companies to produce tanks. And so they controlled the outcome of the means of production.
So did America's war economy.
What's that?
America's war economy was characterized by the same characteristics.
America's wartime economy, you talking about during World War II?
Yes.
That's a pretty interesting question. So, at first in America, when it appeared that we were going to get into World War II, President Roosevelt, would try to get the companies to do what he said, and they refused. And so, what happened was that the companies all gathered in his office. I don't know if they were in the office, but they all communicated with each other, and they sat down. And they go, "Okay, you want us to do something, Mr. You give us a purchase order, and then you pay for it. And you give us a purchase order for how many tanks want, how many aircraft you want. You give us a purchase order, you pay for it, we'll deliver it." And that's what started the American war machine. The risk of war, the sudden appearance of the need to fight, and uh, the capitalism going, okay, you pay for it, we'll do it. He outbid the Roosevelt outbid the making for cars and transferred it and said, give you a purchase order for tanks. And the tanks started to appear, and the war machine took over.
But the Nazis were a war machine from the start because that was a stated aim of Hitler, and he provided private companies with bumper government contracts.
Okay, I'm
And that
not
was
arguing.
also based on competition. It was a system of capitalism.
Okay, I'm not arguing that.
Okay.
I'm not arguing that point.
I want to talk more about the economy now because we haven't really touched on that. How do you think we can reform the way the state works? How do you think we can reform how the economy works? What fundamental problems is the economy facing, and how can we solve them?
Whatever problems face the economy of whatever nation you're referring to,
Yeah, particularly Britain and America.
whatever problems face economy in America, will be negotiated. Policies will be negotiated by the politicians, the left and the right. They'll try to negotiate and come to some agreement. But capitalism itself, so it looks like you want to understand the nature of capitalism, how it works. So capitalism, you might see in this world, if you open up an economic textbook in it, it'll probably say something like capitalism is a marketplace where the government doesn't interfere with the buying and selling of goods and services, which will arrive at a price. The problem in a free market economy. So the problem with that is that you got to define market, you got to define freedom, you got to find a transaction, you got to define all these concepts. So we'll do that really quickly here. Free market enterprise is one, the freedom. And we already touched upon that. Freedom is the creation of a priority and then the effectuation of a priority. So Mr. Entrepreneur has got an idea to make a car. So this guy named Ford goes out and he makes a car. And then what happens is that so you have freedom and then you have the transaction. And a transaction is where Mr. Ford sacrifices his, as we said before, his time, his effort, his knowledge in a arena of risk, and his material and his did I include effort to manufacture something, and we'll call that the sacrifice. And he does that because he wants to obtain a reward, and he wants to sell that automobile in order to get a reward, and that would be somebody else. Somebody gives him some money for that car because um, um, somebody thinks that, well, that car could get me to work a little bit easier, so I'll buy that car. So Ford sells him a car, and so you have a transaction. But Mr. Ford goes ahead with that effectuation of those priorities to manufacture a car only when he's motivated to do so. So capitalism also has motivation. So it's freedom, motivation, a transaction. And so that motivation is when the sacrifice is small and the reward is a lot, you tend to do it. So Mr. Ford saw that I can make this car and I'll be successful. Why? Because I'll be bringing an efficiency to the other guy who buys the car because he can get to work faster. So he implements an efficiency into society and then he receives a reward. And the other guy who bought the Ford, he had to go to work and he saved his money. And so he had a sacrifice that was he was going to sacrifice his money to obtain the reward of the car. So there are two sides to the transaction. So now you have, and then you have the motivation. So now you also have to consider that we can't do it. And Mr. Ford realized he can't do everything together, all by himself. Put that car together and engineer it and everything. So he had helpers. So he had to cooperate with some engineers and helpers and put together the car. So capitalism requires cooperation. And so the more you produce goods and services, the more you have cooperation. And as we remember, let's go back and remember our definition of ethics. Ethics is the appropriate dispensation of respect, and we use respect to cooperate. And suddenly we're getting more cooperation in society through the production of goods and services. And that leads us to a more ethical society, believe it or not, through the production of goods and services. And so you have cooperation induces ethics, but then you also have competition in free market enterprise. So we have to add in competition. And what is competition? Competition, remember we talked about freedom and that it's the creation of a priority and then effectuation of the priority. Well, when you're in a society with other people, they may have the same priority. So when when Mr. Ford creates a car, then he goes out and wants to sell it. Somebody else in society is also looking at that. Maybe a guy named General Motors is looking at it and going, I can make that car too. And so you have competition and when you have competition, you have the narrowing of priorities. In other words, the priorities are now coming closer together to make the same transaction. So what do you do? What does competition do? It causes the law of differentiation to take effect. And that is what produces all the variances in all the stores that you have ever been in your whole life. It produces every variance. So when competition happens and life knows that competition is inimical to your health because it's going to be harder to divide up the resources amongst yourselves. What happens is the law of differentiation comes in and says diversify. Don't become like that other person. And so what happens to Ford? He creates the Model T, and then he creates the Model A, and then he creates but it's all in black. And then General Motors comes out and goes, well, we'll make cars in red and white, and we'll compete against that guy who just made black cars. And so they come out and and that's due to the law of differentiation, because they don't want to directly compete with Mr. Ford. So they go out and they create other cars that might suit the proclivities and the likenesses and the desiderata of other human beings, because all life does that which is good for it. So they diversify through the law of differentiation. And so capitalism is the law of differentiation. It's cooperation. It's ethics. It is the transaction. It is motivation, and it's freedom, all working together. And that's how free market enterprise. And the great thing about it is that when you produce something, you get a return. The reason why you get a return is because it's a reward. And we only do it because we see that there's some goodness in buying that article, and on the manufacturer side, we only manufacture because we see that our product has goodness that will be useful to somebody else, and we'll cooperate together. And so you manufacture more goodness, which brings us up away from misery, and that is the nature of free market enterprise. And we do it peacefully and ethically, because in order to do so, you need cooperation.
I think competition and free markets are really important parts of modern society, and they're far preferable to bureaucracy and state planning, which don't give a freedom to people to actually make choices and provide people with different paths to choose and different ways to consume and produce. But do you think that competition is being eroded in the world today, where there's so many large conglomerates and large monopolies that have so much control over different industries? Do you think we need to regulate those more? Because you can take the example of Unilever and Coca-Cola, for example. When it comes to large-scale consumer products, they own a large amount of even differentiated products, like different types of drinks, but still owned by the same company. Do you think that's healthy?
Well, it's because all life does that which is good for it. And so large companies want to get larger and become more profitable, and produce more things. And they'll produce different things because of the law of differentiation. However, the law of differentiation doesn't just sit there. Other people come around. And so about 50 years ago, a couple of computer companies started happening, and they bring an efficiency into the marketplace, and they become, and they grow, and they become prosperous. And then they'll teach the other companies how to become prosperous, and little companies will grow and become more prosperous and compete with the bigger companies with newer ideas and new products because of the law of differentiation. New products will come out and compete against those big companies. And then the big companies themselves, they tend to, once they become so successful, they tend to believe in themselves, because remember the Lord Acton principle, that power corrupts and power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolute. So the bigger you get, you start to become dominant in the market, and you believe in yourself, and you believe that you are all powerful, and it corrupts the mind, even a mind of a president of a large company. And they tend to stop innovating, and because of that, only their priorities matter, and they forget that actually it's not their priorities, it's the priorities of those who buy their products that he should be thinking of. And when he forgets about that, the companies go by the side, and because they don't continue with the law of differentiation, they ignore it. That's why you take a look at all the companies in 1910 when the Dow started tracking large companies, and they're not existent today. Maybe a couple are, maybe General Motors and Ford, which came along later, but for the most part, they're all gone. And what now dominates the Dow? The Dow is now dominated by other new companies. And so that law of differentiation and freedom, which causes the effectuation of priorities, all produce new companies, all produce new goods, all produce new services, and the cycle goes on.
How do you think governments can foster that innovation and create that economy of creative destruction, as Schumpeter described?
Okay, so the United States, I have to admit, does a pretty good job in fostering productivity in the nation, and they do it because they take some extra money that they'll get, and they give it to the universities, which have which are governed are nonprofit organizations that are deal in the product of producing knowledge. And so there's a synergism that goes with between the government giving grants to places that have good research outfits, and they come up with a lot of good things. And so you come up with so many innovations from that. For example, the space program in the United States back in the 60s was funded by the United States, and a lot of universities helped develop the products. And one of them was one of those products was a spacesuit to keep the astronauts comfortable against the radiation when they're out there on the moon. Well, that material is now on in every single running pair of running shoes in the entire market. So that research produced a very utilitarian product in which I don't know how many companies come out with running shoes. And so that was all from initial research, from initial government giving that money to the universities and those who can do the research. And so, yeah, so I think the United States does a pretty good job in giving research to create more knowledge. And thus, really, our universities are the best in the world. And they produce all the knowledge. And most of the Nobel Prizes are right here. And so most of the knowledge is produced by the universities and the large companies and
Do
small
you
companies.
think do you think there should be any nationalized industry at all?
A nationalized industry. I do. There is one thing that should be nationalized and made a private company. Well, I should say not nationalized, but made like a utility company, which has the limits. Their profits are limited, and that's welfare. The United States gives out too much welfare to too many people, and most of it's stolen, as we can see in news presently. How
Minnesota, I think.
yeah, in Minnesota, how it's stealing billions of dollars. So how do we prevent that? We prevent that by taking, instead of receiving direct from the government, we create, or these NGOs, we create a for-profit, and we limit the profit of a company, a utility company that administers welfare payments. So I think that should be nationalized.
Okay. To finish, which philosopher or economist or politician do you admire the most? Who's inspired you the most?
Your present day or throughout history?
Throughout history, present day, anyone.
Adam Smith, man. Adam Smith, the professor from
Founding
Scotland.
father of economics.
Yes, that's right.
I'm really inspired by him as well. He's really outlined stuff that's still relevant today as well.
That's right. That's right.
Thanks so much for joining me. If you enjoyed that, make sure to subscribe, share, and follow, and also check out the philosophical angle on YouTube. I really want to speak with you again sometime because that was really interesting. This has been Mission Undercover, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye.
Thank you.